I thought I would talk about dark matter, open data portals, and what's actually going on. An enormously humbling title, of course, because it presumes that I know what's going on. Maybe just a little bit about me. This is a Venn diagram to describe what I do with my life. I think a lot about kind of open data and open innovation. I've worked with a number of organizations, especially in the kind of open source world. I've always been a big government geek, so I've always loved public policy. I've done work with a number of think tanks. And then I actually have a background in negotiation and strategy, so I worked for the authors of Getting to Yes, which is a book that some people have read. And so I often end up in a room with people who either violently or not violently disagree and try to help them figure out what they're supposed to be doing. This is kind of some of the organizations that I've worked with. This slide is really only here to make you think that I'm smart and worth listening to, so we're going to just blow by that. I have been involved with open data for actually a shockingly long time, as long as one kind of can be involved in open data. Back in 2009, when the mayor of Vancouver was elected, he called me and a couple of colleagues into a room and said, what should we do around technology? And I and one other person said we should do open data. And so we drafted a motion that got passed, and we became kind of the second large municipality in the world after Washington, D.C. to have an open data portal. And that kind of got me even further and deeper into this world. Since then, I've advised a number of governments, and then I also have a company called Recollect. We manage the interface between the resident and cities around solid waste and recycling, which is a major issue for most cities. And every single week, we remind hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of North Americans to take out their garbage and kind of nudge them to engage in some behavior change. So we've had a lot of success there, and this is us in the Denver. This is a shameless plug. This is us on the Denver webpage, the pink outline of what we do. I'm very, very happy to talk to people later about that. To talk about kind of open data and what I think is actually going on and why, and what's actually disruptive about what we're doing, I wanted to maybe just do a little bit of history around something that I think is like open data, but predates us quite significantly. And so I want to talk about freedom of information requests and where they come from. So not everybody knows, but the first kind of classically recognized freedom of information legislation was passed in 1766 in Sweden, in which you kind of had the right to go and demand the Swedish government show you whatever document they happen to have kind of on file, in this case probably on parchment. You know, that was a great start. There was a little bit of a gap between that and the next one. So I'm going to mark it with a double slash because our graph would get kind of challenging. 1966, United States passes access to information legislation. It's actually quite weak legislation compared to what you're used to now. I don't even think it has like the requirement. It's kind of more like you're allowed to ask now. It's not even we have to give. So it's not quite as strong. And then throughout the 70s, you get a couple more. The United States actually gets more firm, like real, what we consider now to be FOIA legislation. So you get a couple more countries doing it. And then in the 1980s, a few more kind of begin to show. There's my country, we kind of begin to show up, start to play. And then, you know, now more recently, I mean, I'm obviously missing some, but it kind of gives you the sense of the history. And I think there's a couple things interesting about this. The first thing is, with the exception of our friends in Sweden, this stuff's all relatively modern. It's all quite new. And in fact, it didn't even all happen at once. You know, first there were a couple countries in the 60s and 70s, and then more recently it's kind of picked up steam. And you'd actually be amazed how many countries still don't have access to information legislation. And I think one of the questions I always want to make people ask themselves is, well, why did this happen now? Like, so why in the sun period starting about 1966 do you suddenly start to get access to information laws? And it's a question that, you know, if you begin to ask people, they'll have various responses, but usually there's one or two. So the true kind of, in theory, academic response to this is that you had this congressman who was a Democrat. He was very, very concerned about how much money was being spent by the military in the kind of build up to the Cold War and wanted some disclosure legislation to figure out where all this money was going, how was it being spent, because he couldn't even figure it out. And he just saw billions getting funneled into projects and he didn't know what was happening. So that was Johnny Moss. And that kind of explains what triggered the 1966 relatively weak legislation. But it's the 1974 legislation that actually has teeth, what really kind of has the cultural understanding of where access information or FOIA legislation comes from. And that's very much thanks to this guy, who, maybe not intentionally, for those who are younger in the audience, you might recognize him more by looking at this photo. Who, of course, did some things that some people found problematic And it actually galvanized, or so the legend goes, it galvanizes a coalition of progressive electors who then come together and say, we need to do something about this to make sure government's more transparent. We can't have another tricky dick. And so as a result, what we end up getting is FOIA legislation that has real teeth, and that's what everybody copies after that. So that's the kind of the narrative. And I think the narrative is right, but you have to ask yourself, why Nixon? It's not like you'd never had a corrupt politician before. In fact, if you go back into the 1950s, there was, I think it was called the Ohio Gang. It was like kind of 5 members of cabinets or their direct reports who were notoriously known for being relatively corrupt and assigning contracts to their friends and basically taking payouts here in DC. Like, these were federal cabinet ministers. But why didn't that prompt federal legislation? Or that any number of scandals could have prompted it. Why suddenly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s do you get this emergence of FOIA legislation? And I think the actual explanation is more nuanced and kind of interesting. It's because this device gets invented. And in fact, if you look at the history of this device, it has some very interesting parallels. So, 1960, the Xerox 914 photocopier is invented. Take a look at this. Not 8 years later, that device suddenly has $1 billion in sales. And you have to understand, from 1950 to 1959, Xerox's entire revenue for the entire decade was $12 million. And suddenly in 8 years, they were doing $1 billion a year by the end of that 8th year. That is the kind of growth that not even Google can replicate. In fact, Fortune magazine calls the Xerox copier the single most successful launch of a product in the history of the United States. And it keeps growing. We go out further, in 1970, they're at 1.6 billion, and then by 1980, they're at $8 billion in sales. And this is just Xerox, and at this point, they actually only own something like 40 or 50% of the market at this point. So the market's like dramatically larger, and in fact, they're starting to get eaten up because the Koreans are moving in and other people are moving in, and photocopiers are becoming more commoditized. My point to all you is that FOIA is actually entirely only made possible by the existence of the photocopier. Because if you didn't have the photocopier, how in the heck were you going to make all those copies that people were going to be requesting of the documents that they wanted to see, especially if they didn't live in the same city as you? And my fear around all this is that we here in kind of the open data, and specifically I'm going to be talking to Socrata because I care a lot about them, and they've asked me to come and give a talk, and they don't really know what I'm going to say, and I think they're a little bit nervous, and I'm going to make them even more nervous. Is that I really fear that we are all locating ourselves the wrong place on this technology stack. And that when we look at the photocopier and ATIP or FOIA legislation in this country, this is kind of what the technology stack looks like. There's the black box of whatever happens inside government, which is recorded, typed up, and kind of stored. And there's a FOIA process that gets tapped on the very top of that, of which this new technology called the photocopier enables us to do. So we're not really interested in the black box. We're just this layer that goes on the top of it and allows everything else to be thing. And this is my enormous fear, which is that Socrata and all of the work that we're doing, the open data portals, are simply replicating what the photocopier did. That we're merely a glorified photocopier that's sitting on top of a government stack that is a distribution mechanism that happens to be significantly more efficient and more kind of impactful because it can do drawings and charts and things like that than a photocopier is. But at the end of the day, it's merely a very, very sophisticated and advanced photocopier. And if that's all we become, if that's what all of this is about, I think we're in real trouble. In fact, I think we're in very, very, very big trouble. Because if that's what we are, I think right now, most of our open data portals live in the wrong part of the technology stack. And that we are focused on the kind of the transparency piece or the kind of the openness piece and the open data piece. And so the justification for all of this then becomes, and you guys have kind of heard this a whole bunch of times today, there's all this external use. This is what we're going to hope is going to save us, the apps we hope are going to save us. I thought Waldo had a fantastic talk, and so I don't want to kind of repeat too much what he says, but like there's going to be some local hacking, it's going to create something that's going to be great. And there are like some cool things that happen as a result of that. I always love this one, which was, this is like this, how long will it take for you to get from an address in Edmonton to any other address using Google's transit data? And basically like red's like 2 minutes on transit, and then purple's like an hour, and if you don't have a color, you're just basically never getting there on public transit. And what's cool is you can then apply this hack to kind of any city that has Google Transit data. So I love that. It's like a great little hack. This is a wonderful example of like a problem that 15 years ago was like a $50,000 to $100,000 problem to solve, and now is like a 6-pack of beer and a weekend with like a couple of guys who maybe don't smell as good as they should at the end of it. And then you have all sorts of analysis that can now happen. This is like relatively old now, but Stephen B. Johnson's analysis of 311 data in New York, which is kind of cool. And of course, you have applications that are sitting on top of cities' websites that can draw or feed into open data portals. This, of course, as people are probably familiar with by now, is see-click-fix. I always love this one because this is in Grand Prairie. You've probably never heard of Grand Prairie, Alberta, because it's a relatively small town. A wonderful example of taking, what in the 1980s and 1990s, doing 311, doing an implementation of 311 was like a $2 to $10 million problem, and see-click-fix has transformed it into kind of a 5 or a 6-digit problem for you. Amazing ability, and of course, like shamelessly again, whoa, oh my gosh, garbage information also available on your stack, as is financial information. I persuaded the government of Ontario to share their budget on using this platform. So all of those kind of wonderful innovations taking place, but they're not hugely impactful. To be blunt, even my own company, which I love and want to talk to you about, we're like a 5-digit for a big city, 4-digit for a small city solution. I think we have high impact, but to sit on top of a Socrata platform, we can't be the win. It's just not worth it. And you're going to have a lot of us in order to be a big win, and that's going to take some time to come. So if that's what we're sitting around and waiting for, we may sit longer than we are able to justify budgets to be sitting around for, and I'm a little bit nervous about that. And I think even when the examples get amazing, it still hurts you. So these guys here, so I do work as a negotiation person, and I work with environmentalists and loggers and help them solve some problems. And I love this photo. You're in a room right now. Those guys are loggers. There's an environmentalist in there, and they're trying to figure out where the resources should be extracted and where they shouldn't be extracting them, in order to maximize the benefit to wildlife and to preserve as much of the wilderness that needs to be, that is most essential to be preserved, to try to find that balance between the environmentalists and the loggers. And here's what's totally amazing is not all of it, but huge amounts of what's appearing on those maps is actually open data. And this is all part of what's called the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, and if I were to kind of take what the total value of what's being discussed in this room, or at least across the country in various rooms as this is being talked about, I don't know, all of the valuations of all the logging companies in the country, the total what they contribute to the economy, the benefit to them of not having to fight against environmentalists, the benefit to the environmental movement of not having to expend money running campaigns against them and focusing on other more critical issues. It's easily in the billions. It's easily, just the stock valuations alone, probably for all of the companies involved, in $500 million to $1 billion range. Jobs, it's all $1 billion. And the terrible thing is, none of this, even when you have a project that big, not a path to sustainability for you guys, because you're never going to hear about it. And you're never going to be able to tell your political masters you were the instrumental piece in doing that, because part of it is you weren't. There were a lot of instrumental pieces of which you were one. None of this stuff is a path to sustainability in the short, and I fear even the medium term. And as a result, when we become the photocopier and we're merely the distribution mechanism, we, in the eyes, the long-term eyes especially of the government, we become a cost center. We are something that we are spending money on because we have a hard to quantify, or at least difficult to quantify, or not a very great quantified value impact. And this is why, when I look at the people in this room and when I look at Socrata, my real feeling is I don't think Socrata is an open data company. I actually feel that is way too small for what Socrata can be. I think it's so much bigger than that. And I don't think that you guys are actually open data groups. I think this is the trap that you run the risk of falling into. The open data portal is the MacGuffin device in this entire conversation. For those of you who don't know what a MacGuffin device is, it's this thing. It's the briefcase in Pulp Fiction that everybody in the movie is totally obsessed about, and it drives the action, but you actually never find out what's inside it, and nor do you even actually care. It's not relevant, but it's critical at the same time. The openness is the excuse to marshal the resources and to get people focused to thinking about data and to thinking about how government works. It's the wedge that gets us into the conversation and getting in with the right values, doing the right thing in the right way. We are actually systems integrators. We are grabbing data from across government and trying to figure out how we can have more and more people to use that data, whether they're inside or outside, and more systems to be built on top of that data and getting those systems to talk about it. I think Socrata is actually an API company, and I think it's potentially the digital glue that holds government together. This is a much bigger vision and a much bigger opportunity, and one that puts it at the core of the conversation. So this is what I fear that we're doing. And this is where we should be in the stack, not just Socrata, but all of you as well. You shouldn't be at the top of this thing as a delivery vehicle. You should be at the bottom of the stack, at the very core of it. This is the data upon which everything should be drawn from and should be built upon. This is where I believe you should be located in the stack. And that everybody should be looking to you guys and say, okay, well, how do I build my analysis on top of you, whether they're inside or outside of government? And so the external conversation is merely, that's like the icing on the cake. The cake part is the internal conversation and all the internal benefits you can drive, which I'd like to think will be easier for us to quantify because at least we control more of the variables. So for me, it's the question of, first, how do we create more effective and efficient government? So it came up today in the conversation. For all of the Socrata open data portals, and for every time I've ever talked to someone who run an open data portal, at first, and often for a number of years, the majority of visitors who come to your open data portal come from IP addresses within the government. And it's not surprising. It's because the data that government has is most useful to public servants. It's not surprising. Just the great thing is that it used to be to get that data, I'd have to go ask Johnny, who'd have to get his lawyer involved, and then we'd have to like 3 meetings, and I'd have to sign some sort of like non-disclosure agreement before I was actually allowed to hold the data, or I had to go give him a 6-pack of beer. But one of those 2 things had to happen for me to get this data that I needed, and now I can just go click on it. And so this is as much about business process and architecture and IT systems architecture as it is about kind of sharing data with the public. And so, I shared at the table, kind of ruining my talk a little bit. Like if I want to develop a really simple ROI for what I think open data portals would do, I would not even count anything external. I would only focus on internal. And I'd take total number of IP addresses that visit the government from within your government, multiply it by 5%, so you get 5% of those, times that by 1 hour. Let's assume that each one of those people would have normally taken an hour to find the data set that they wanted, and maybe a certain number of them would have spent more and not actually gotten a result. And then add 1% of that total and assume that that took 5 hours. Actually, this is an incredibly conservative estimate, but I like to be conservative because I think the number's still going to be way bigger than your budget. And then you could maybe add on some unquantifiable benefit of having better public policy, but sadly, that's the part that's not easy to quantify. And then the other piece for me is all about reasserting control over vendors and making things easier to kind of work on. So I shared with you guys before, SeeClickFix and Recollect, but the real story behind these guys is how interchangeable our products are, how commoditized they have become, and how they force us to innovate and think of actually still more additional things that we can be doing. Because once you have once you have an application on top of your open data portal, it's actually not hard for you to go out to an RFP process and say, hey, so here's the data that we have, here's how we structure it, here's the value we like to get from it. Can someone else create software that would collect this more effectively or do this analysis more effectively for us? It totally changes what your vendor environment could look like. And we're the small fry right now. Recollect, SeeClick, we're the small fry in this game. There are much bigger opportunities. I'm kind of thinking to myself, how do we get to a place where Socrata is not replacing some SeeClickFix or garbage widget, but is looking at a $10 million system that you guys are paying for and figuring out ways to replace that with a 6-digit or a low 7-digit application. And then turning around and making all that data open and going back out to the vendors again and saying, hey, we'd like to take another cut at making this still cheaper. How do you guys make the vendors that you have interchangeable? How do you commoditize the systems that are sitting on top? Or by commoditizing, force still better innovation so you guys can do more and force the marketplace to feed you better? Because right now the marketplace for most government software is pretty crappy. And how do you increase the flexibility for internal use and allow for more data analytics? These, for me, it's all internal. This, for me, is all the stuff that should be driving what you guys are doing. And that, again, is because we are systems integrators. And at the moment, we look like this. The system that we have to integrate, these are the tools that we use. You and I, we're like loading bags of sand. And this is like our best IT tool that we have. It's like the palette. And my hope is what Socrata is giving us is something like the shipping container, which totally destroys the way that we loaded ships and the way that shipping worked, and it completely expands the amount of shipping that takes place, creates an enormous global network. Like our entire economy today is built around this box. And so how do we get off of these pallets and all of these kind of customized local government solutions that I think are like, you pay way too much for it and are really terrible, and like get to this with Socrata around your data so that you guys really can do some stuff that's like interchangeable, swapping people out and making yourselves way more efficient. So when I look at these two worlds, when you're at the top of the stack, you're basically involved in a world of content distribution, which is not like, it's like good, but it's not amazing. Your goal is like, are we on the website? Are we doing extra things? You have to go pull content from various agencies, sometimes against their will, in these timely processes. How are we pulling this stuff out? And you're ultimately a checkbox on somebody's decision around how transparent are we being. And it's not really actually a concern with usage. Whereas if you're at the bottom of the stack, now you're a systems integrator. And your core infrastructure. You're demanding and expecting people to build on top of you. You are core to the functioning of the government now. There's no question anymore about what your budget should look like and whether you should exist and how much more money we should give you. The question is how much money are you demonstrating that you're saving us internally? And you're effectively a platform, and you're no longer a checkback. You're a required spec in every single system that gets built. That is a power. I'd rather be one spec in every single RFP than the hoped for continuation of a politician's desire to demonstrate transparency to the public. So for me, kind of openness is a byproduct of good architecture and best practices. The reason why we do open data is because it allows us to force into the institution a whole bunch of best practices that they should be doing, but have not been doing, and to create systems that actually do work. It's not the end game in of itself. It is the MacGuffin device. And it's the dark matter of public policy, of all of the things of like where you're located in the stack, all of the culture of who's sharing, who's in control, all of that dark matter that's around the Open Data Portal, that's the stuff that actually matters, not the portal itself. It's got to be a great experience, and not only that, it is going to be core infrastructure, so you better make sure it's right. But you guys, the customers, Socrata's got that covered. That's their job. Your job is the dark matter all around it and making sure you're actually using it in a way that's going to transform government and make you more relevant. So my one big plea from all you is don't end up here in the stock. And I know Socrata, like I know, and I say this because I love Socrata and I really want them to succeed. Don't start at the top and work your way down. That's been going on, and it's been great because I think you needed to do that. You needed to, because that's the easy way to get in. But we now have enough data that we know. We know hackathons don't work. We know how many applications are going to get built on the stack in the short term. I actually think in the long term there's huge opportunity, but it's not going to be the thing that you can, like, if you go in selling that, I think we are going to run into a brick wall in the not too distant future. So don't work your way down because I don't think it's sustainable. You've got to work your way up. And so I think now, when you're starting to pitch yourselves, I want you to come in at the bottom and say, we actually matter. We're core to what you're going to do. We are here to solve critical business problems. We're a key piece of infrastructure that can help you do analysis better, can do all these things better. That's the selling point. And the fact that we make government more open, more transparent, and people can build businesses and things on top of that, that is all icing. It is amazing, it's icing, and maybe that's what the politicians want to talk about in the public, but internally, you guys know your budget's actually tied to success here. That's my hard-hitting hot talk. My name's David Eaves. I have more slides I can share, but I want to stop there and just see if there's any questions, because I'm not sure how much more time I have. So thank you guys so much.
So when you say starting at the bottom of the stack, do you mean like replacing data, like instead of Socrata being, dealing with the openness issue and competing with whoever they're competing with like Oracle and database producers and starting from there and building systems on top of them?
Those are your words and not mine. I want to be really clear. About that. I wouldn't know who all the players are that they would have to be competing with in that place. But yeah, I do believe that cities have been working with systems integrators that are very, very expensive, and that open data portals in general offer an escape and an opportunity to reposition the government in its relationship with those vendors by sucking the data out of those systems and then turning around and saying, we can now go into the marketplace and ask anybody to say, can you build on top of this data? And can you build systems that will collect this data more effectively? This is I call this the long con, but I think this is like the most important thing for the sustainability of an open data project.
So to be at the bottom of the stack, you have to work with closed data. What are the plans around working with closed data? What are the tools to do that?
So my understanding is that, and the Socrata team can correct me if I'm wrong, but Socrata can equally handle closed data as it can open data. And in fact, you can simply say, yeah, here's a data set that I want to make available internally, but I don't want to make available externally. And this for me is actually this is one of the most important uses of Socrata, is that if we think of it only as a tool for sharing data publicly, I think we're only making use of kind of like a fraction of the percentage of the value of what Socrata can offer. Because I would love nothing more than to see actually critical government data that can't be shared publicly made available internally, so that people internally can be building applications off of it and doing analysis on it, even if they're only inside government.
Yeah, I think maybe it would make sense if I, as the CEO of Socrata, responded a little bit to your provocative comments, because I think actually David is spot on, and so what I'll share with you all as friends in the room is the most significant portion of Socrata's growth in revenue is actually for internal use cases. So the examples that David is highlighting here. So I'll give you a couple examples of this. So our oldest customer in the federal government here in the United States is Medicare, and when they started using our platform in 2009, literally they spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $25,000 a year, basically for open data, to put public data sets online on data.medicare.gov. And I'll share with you all, hopefully you won't tweet this, but I'll share it with you in the confidence of the confines of this summit. They spend $100,000 a month on the Socrata platform today. And if you went and you asked the Chief Technology Officer of Medicare, wow, are you guys spending $100,000 a month on open data? They'd say, not a chance. Not any stretch are we doing that. But what we're doing is we're shifting the multiple millions of dollars that we're spending on enterprise data technology that frankly is 25 years old, and we're moving it to a cloud-based platform because our data is now API enabled. And now what we're able to do is we're able to go to our systems integrators and say, don't build a whole stack. Don't go buy web servers and database servers and operating systems and go get visualization libraries and do all these things. What I'd like you to do is take the data that we already have in our open data platform, is what they still call it. Take that data and use the APIs and just go build the apps that we want. And so instead of it costing $2 million in a year and a half to build this project, literally it costs $75,000 in 6 weeks for them to turn it around. So you're absolutely right. And I think one of the interesting things, and I use this expression from time to time, is that open data awakens the senses of government CTOs and CIOs about the data assets that they have, and totally changes the way they think about it. And we've been doing some interesting analysis of our customer base over the last couple of months, and we've observed a really interesting pattern, which is when we do a cohort analysis of our customers, basically grouping them based on the year that they started using Socrata, we basically see a very pronounced, very noticeable increase in usage, increase in revenue per customer, increase in dramatic proliferation of our software within their organization. And so we started asking the logical questions of, hey, what's going on? What happens when this inflection point hits? And obviously we're thinking about, well, how can we do more of that? That's a good thing. And what ends up happening is the relationship between Socrata and the government organization moves from a program manager, program director, somebody who's kind of responsible for external data sharing, to a CIO or a CTO or a chief data officer who now manages both the Socrata budget and the Oracle budget, the IBM budget, the systems integrator budget, and says, whoa, who snuck this thing in? This is really interesting. This is something that I thought we were acquiring to do external data sharing, but now that I see the opportunity, I see the application, the first logical question that they ask is, can we put private internal data in this? And so we are. And so the last point that I'll make on this, back to the Medicare example, we're working on an elevated information security threshold for our platform at the request of Medicare. They've asked us intentionally, can you guys go through this process to get your information security rating even higher than what we need for public data? And the reason that we want to do that is we have a 5 billion record claims database that we'd like to put into the Socrata platform, take advantage of this new user experience that you've shown us, and by the way, do all sorts of interesting things with that data that today is really hard to do. We said, yeah, we'd love to do that. And by the way, the legacy environment that this data sits in today, this is a read-only data set. The legacy environment, just the license, just the maintenance fee on the license for the database is $100 million a year. So they are looking at like, wow, let's move this thing to a cloud-based platform that's far more cost-effective. I'll make one more final point, which is here's kind of the way that I've been thinking about it in the last.
My only goal is to flush you out.
That's right. Hey,
so,
no, it's good.
Like,
it's good.
Mission accomplished.
That's
I'm like.
That's good. So here's a slightly different way to think about it. I'm a software engineer. I'm a database guy, by training and by early career. And in your typical enterprise, your typical business enterprise, the read-write ratio is generally about 15% write and 85% read. And so basically businesses create data and they do data processing, and then 85% of the time they're creating reports and dashboards and distributing that data. In government, it's 1% write, 99% read. It's basically reused over and over and over and over again. And so what we're trying to do now with our most mature customers, and some of these ones, by the way, have entered into design partner agreements with us to take our open data portal, as David calls it, and move it inside and create an inward-facing data space is what we're calling this internally. And so what we're trying to articulate now is keep your 1% where you're doing data creation and data processing in your system of record. If that's so sacred to you that you couldn't possibly think about moving that to the cloud, and you couldn't think about doing that in a lower cost delivery model, fine, keep your 1% there, but take your 99% and move that to a system of engagement that is designed for engaging and experiencing your data, and do that in a much more cost-effective footprint than the old legacy enterprise technology that you're used to buying. So that's kind of the way that we're thinking about it.
And I want to be clear too. Like, I really do come at this from a place of love, both of government and of open data. I'm a hardcore open data advocate. Like the slide you saw with those environmentalists and with the logger, when my worlds collide in that way, when my negotiating world and my open data world collide like that, I was just blown away with happiness. I'm really driven by the concern I have is this play is actually an open data preservation play. It's just that we're riding a great wave, but it is not going to last for forever. The words open data are not going to be magical for forever. So we've got to figure out a way to make this sustainable when the buzzword isn't as hot as it is right now. And I don't know if it's already started to become less hot. I feel like I feel like the wave has crested. It's still a long way to go, but I feel like it has crested. Again, like when I was kind of talking about the number of people who come to an open data portal being driven internally most first, that 40 or 50%. And no, for Socrata portals, I believe it's over 50%. That was from another portal that I just happen to know about. I know that number has declined, but it's actually only declined in relative terms. In absolute terms, the number of government employees still remains high. It's just now slowly the rest of the public is starting to show up. I think it takes years for a public kind of consumer base for an open data portal to emerge. It takes years. And so you have I think you have between 3, most optimistically, wildly optimistically, and 10 to 15 years to have to be around before you can actually point to a public usage that's going to be significant. And I believe in the interim, if that curve is going to look like this, or it's just going to look like that, you've got to have something that's filling up the other part of that curve, and I believe that's your internal use. And so I believe you got to use this as a really interesting change tool to rethink the way government works, and it's an amazing opportunity.
I just want to find out, is this a lucky outfit you're wearing right here?
Why is this because I also wore this at the Code for America Summit?
At the Code for America Summit, everybody pointed out that he wore the same thing.
So that was so in my defense, I wore a different striped shirt the year before, but in the bright lights of a poor shot it ended up on Twitter, it did look a lot like my previous shirt. And so, but this is actually the same shirt I wore on one of the 3 days I was at the Code for America Summit. I have a strong fashion sense that's very narrow in its implementation.
David, I do have one question
Yeah.
that I'll just throw in there for the benefit of a lot of the folks in the audience here and your experience working with a whole bunch of different open data programs. And I know we're talking about something bigger than open data, but the characteristics of a data team, let's just call it a data team, the people that are actually running the program and driving it forward, can you describe a little bit of what you've seen work there in terms of the people?
Yeah, so I feel like, again, the internal focus really matters a lot. I think the open data portals that have the most success have an analytics team attached to them that is actually going around and figuring out ways to save agencies money. They're saying we found this in this agency where the big example. New York always gets cited as the big example and the amazing work that they did. But when you show up and you say we've actually solved a business problem and we found an efficiency for you because you let us examine your data, I think that starts turning some heads. You got to do it right. You can't just show up and be like, hey, we found something you guys didn't. Why were you idiots to not see this before, right? That's obviously not going to help. But if you do it right, that I feel like you should. Almost anyone who launches an open data platform should have an internal analytics team immediately next to it, because if you don't, you basically are relying on a variable that you cannot control to justify and explain your existence, which is people outside of your organization and external actors. You're hoping that they're going to show up and make it all relevant and have meaning. And sometimes that happens, and sometimes it happens enough, and it's awesome. But you do know that you're now putting your destiny under variables that you no longer control. Whereas when you have an internal analytics team, you now have a variable you do control, one that you can shape and one that you can kind of boost and push in different ways. And if they can demonstrate success, then the whole project seems to work a whole lot better in my experience. So that would be if you do one thing, I would do that. I also believe that the other key thing, and this is maybe biases of mine because I have a negotiation background, but I do actually believe your number one job in liberating data is actually simply charming and friending the lawyers and getting people to love you and being inspired by your vision and hacking their bureaucracy. It's actually 0 technical skill and 100% soft skill. So whatever you can do to beef up your ability to hack bureaucracy, that I would be doing in spades. So the soft skills almost matter more than the hard skills.
Awesome, thanks. Any other questions?
Over there. So one is I would, just so you track it, I'd be like, what's the external usage? Can we find any good stories? But I wouldn't ride on that. I would actually instead be kind of being like, how much money, how many lives were we able to save, or how much money were we able to save by analyzing some data sets that people were willing to put on the portal, even if it was behind the firewall and never shared with the public, but our team was able to analyze and find something interesting with. At the moment you turn around and you can say something like, we just saved the city $300,000 or even $100,000, people are going to suddenly be like, oh, wow, there's an opportunity space that we didn't actually see that as being part of this. And if you say, yeah, that's what happens when you start bringing data onto a portal where people can begin to play with it. And sometimes that's going to happen in the public, and sometimes that's going to happen within City Hall. So the metrics for me would be like, are you saving people's lives? Are you saving money? are you making people's lives better in some sort of way? And actually having some targeted, like going in and being like, you don't have to have 50 successes, actually just 1 or 2 successes in those types of stories, I think can cause enough heads to turn to at least begin to cause a conversation that make people say, maybe we should give you some more resources. Maybe this is actually way more strategic than we thought. Maybe this is not just about being a photocopier. This is actually about being something really deep and important in our organization.
Great.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, Socrata invited me here, and like Saf, I think, went on a limb, and he said, like, Dave, come here and like say something that we need to hear, and that's going to be challenging. And I really, it is not a lot of companies that will invite someone like me to come and give a talk and really try to test and push them. I believe enormously in Socrata. And the reason I gave this talk is not because I actually don't think we're just about open data portals, which I think is like an interesting problem. I think this company is so much more, and what you guys are doing is so much more. It's about the transformation of the way government works. And I wanted to come here and shake you guys and say, wake up to this much, much bigger opportunity and don't let it slip you by.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. Appreciate it.